Most people believe the American mainland was safe during the Second World War. They think the fighting happened far away in Europe or on islands in the Pacific. This belief offers comfort, but it is not true. There is a cold, hard fact that many forget. For over a year, enemy soldiers lived on American soil. They marched on American land. They set up camps and built defenses on islands that belonged to the United States. This is the story of that forgotten time. It is a story of how a remote, wind-swept chain of islands became the only place in America occupied by a foreign enemy. To understand this event, we must look at a map of the North Pacific. A string of islands called the Aleutians stretches from Alaska out toward Asia. These islands are not warm or sunny. They are places of terrible weather. Thick fog covers the islands for days. The wind blows with the force of a hurricane. Rain falls almost every day. In 1942, few people lived there. It was a lonely place. It was a place where the United States felt safe because the weather was so bad. The American military did not think anyone would try to attack such a desolate region. They were wrong. The enemy saw something different. The Japanese military looked at the Aleutians as a door to America. They did not want the islands for their wealth, they wanted them for position. If they controlled these islands, they could stop American ships from moving west. They could build airfields to bomb cities in Alaska. They could even threaten the west coast of the United States. The Japanese commanders, specifically Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, saw an opportunity. He planned a complex operation. He wanted to strike two places at once. One strike would go to a place called Midway. The other would go to the Aleutians. This was a trick. He hoped the American ships would rush north to defend Alaska. Then he could take Midway easily. The plan did not work out as he hoped. The American codebreakers were smart. They read the Japanese messages. The United States Navy knew about the plan for Midway. They sent their ships there. They did not send everything north. However, the Japanese force in the north was real. It was not a ghost story. On June 3, 1942, the people of the Aleutians heard the sound of engines. It was the sound of war arriving on their doorstep. The first target was Dutch Harbor. This was a busy little port on an island called Unalaska. It had a small base. It had a hospital. It had fishermen and local people living their lives. Early that morning, the sky was gray. The clouds were low. Suddenly, Japanese planes appeared. They came from aircraft carriers sitting in the fog. They dropped bombs. They strafed the ground with machine gun fire. The American soldiers there were surprised. They were not ready for a full air raid. The attack on Dutch Harbor caused panic. The bombs hit the barracks. They hit the hospital. Men ran to their guns. They fired back at the sky. A few Japanese planes were shot down. One crashed on the ground. The pilot died. It was the first Japanese body on American soil from this war. The attack lasted for 2 days. The damage was not total, but the message was clear. The war was not far away. The war was here. While the bombs fell on Dutch Harbor, another group of Japanese soldiers moved quietly through the fog. Their target was further west. They aimed for two small, almost unknown islands. These were Attu and Kiska. These islands were very close to the tip of Asia. They were the far end of the chain. Very few people lived there. Attu had a small village. It had a radio station. Kiska had a weather station. These places had no army. They had no defenses. They were open doors waiting to be pushed. On June 7, 1942, the invasion happened. Japanese troops landed on Attu. There was no fight. There was no resistance. The weather was the main enemy that day. The fog was so thick the soldiers could barely see. They came ashore and took control. They found the local people. These were the Aleuts. They were native people who had lived on the islands for thousands of years. They lived simple lives. They hunted and fished. They were peaceful. The Japanese soldiers gathered the people of Attu. There was a man named Foster Jones. He worked for the Weather Bureau. He was a civilian. The Japanese captured him. He became the first American prisoner of war taken on American soil. He was taken to Japan. He would never return. The rest of the villagers were also prisoners in their own homes. Their world changed in a single day. They were now under the rule of the Emperor of Japan. Then, the Japanese moved to Kiska. They landed there, too. They found a small group of American weathermen. They also found the United States Navy radio operators. The Americans on Kiska were few. They had no weapons to fight a war. They saw the Japanese ships. They saw the soldiers. They destroyed their radio codes so the enemy could not read them. Then, they surrendered. They were taken away as prisoners. The Japanese now owned 2 pieces of the United States. This was a moment of deep shame and fear for America. The news was shocking. The government in Washington tried to hide the full truth at first. They did not want people on the West Coast to panic. But the truth came out. The Japanese were in Alaska. They were setting up machine guns on American mountains. The psychological impact was heavy. Americans felt unsafe. They felt the enemy was peeking through the window. Life for the Japanese soldiers on Attu and Kiska was very hard. They did not find paradise. They found a frozen hell. The islands were cold and wet. The soldiers had to dig holes in the ground to live. They put tents over the holes to keep the wind out. They called themselves the Arctic Army. They were far from home. They were far from supplies. The American Navy made sure no Japanese ships could easily bring food or bullets. This led to a strange and terrible time. The soldiers on the islands were trapped. The Japanese did not just sit there. They started to build. They wanted to turn the islands into fortresses. They brought construction equipment. They tried to build an airfield on Kiska. They wanted a place where planes could land and refuel. This would allow them to fly over the ocean and bomb the mainland of Alaska. It was a real threat. If they finished the airfield, the war could spread to cities like Anchorage or even Seattle. The American military knew they had to stop this, but they could not just rush in. The weather was too bad. The distance was too great. The United States started a long campaign to bomb the Japanese positions. It was a campaign of frustration. American planes would fly out to attack Kiska or Attu, but the fog would roll in. They could not see the target. They had to turn back. Sometimes they dropped bombs blindly. They rarely hit anything. The pilots faced dangers that were just as bad as the enemy. The wind was fierce. It was called the WWII. This was a sudden, violent wind that came down from the mountains. It could flip a plane over on the runway. It could tear a plane apart in the sky. Many American airmen died not from enemy fire, but from the weather. They crashed into the cold ocean. They crashed into the mountains. The islands were eating them alive. Meanwhile, the Japanese soldiers on the ground suffered too. They had limited food. They ate rice and whatever they could find. They hunted birds. They fished, but the constant bombing kept them on edge. They could not sleep well. They knew the Americans were coming eventually. They dug tunnels. They hid their guns in the hills. They prepared for a fight they knew would happen. The local Ailit people suffered the most during this time. On Attu, the Japanese treated them poorly. The villagers were taken from their homes. They were forced to work. The Japanese needed labor. They made the Ailit men carry supplies. The women were forced to do laundry and cooking for the soldiers. It was a hard life. The Japanese soldiers were often cruel. They did not have enough food for themselves, so they certainly did not share much with the prisoners. The Ailits lived in fear every day. There was a specific event that showed the darkness of this occupation. The Japanese decided they could not keep the villagers on Attu. They were a burden. They were mouths to feed. In September of 1942, the Japanese put the people of Attu on a ship. They told them they were going to a better place. They lied. They took them to a prison camp in Japan. The conditions on the ship were terrible. It was crowded. It was dirty. When they arrived in Japan, they were put in a camp called Otaru. It was cold there. They were forced to work in a factory. They had no warm clothes. Many of them got sick. Many of them died. They were far from their windswept home, suffering in a foreign land. Back in the United States, the military command was under pressure. The man in charge of the defense of Alaska was General Simon Bolivar Buckner. He was a tough man. He was a soldier's soldier. He knew that leaving the enemy on American soil was unacceptable. He pushed for action. He wanted to push the Japanese out. But he faced a massive problem. He did not have enough men. He did not have enough ships. Most of the resources were going to the fight in the South Pacific. The war in the Aleutians was considered a sideshow. It was the forgotten war. The American public began to hear stories. They heard about the Kiska Blitz. This was a strange event. American planes bombed Kiska constantly, but the Japanese were smart. They learned to hide. They moved their anti-aircraft guns. They camouflaged their tents. The bombing went on for months. It was a battle of nerves. The Americans wanted to make the Japanese feel unsafe. The Japanese wanted to survive until help came. There was a hidden fear during this time. The Americans worried that the Japanese would use these islands to launch a biological attack. There were rumors that the Japanese were testing germ warfare. These rumors were not true, but the fear was real. The military leaders in Washington were terrified that the Japanese would send balloons with bombs or diseases across the Pacific. The occupation of Attu and Kiska made these fears seem possible. It added to the urgency to remove the enemy. The buildup for a counterattack was slow. It was painful. American soldiers were sent to Alaska. They were sent to places like Adak and Amchitka. These islands were closer to the enemy. They built their own airfields. They lived in mud. They lived in constant rain. The soldiers called themselves the Frozen Chosen. They felt ignored by the rest of the country. They trained in the cold. They learned how to survive in the wind. They knew they had a job to do. They had to take back their country. The Japanese on the islands were not passive. They sent planes to bomb the new American bases. They sent ships to bring in more supplies. This led to a series of naval battles in the fog. One famous battle happened in March of 1943. It was called the Battle of the Komandorsky Islands. A Japanese fleet tried to bring supplies to Attu and Kiska. They were met by an American fleet. It was a strange fight. It happened in the open ocean. There were no islands to hide behind. It was a gunfight between ships. The Americans had smaller ships, but they fought with great bravery. The Japanese had larger ships, but they turned away. They were afraid of American bombers from the land. They retreated. This was a turning point. It meant the Japanese soldiers on the islands would not get much more help. They were cut off. The stage was set. The Americans had a base close enough to attack. The Japanese were stranded. The winter was ending. The spring of 1943 was coming. General Buckner and Admiral Thomas Kinkaid made a plan. They would not attack both islands at once. They would focus on one. They chose Attu. It was the smaller island. It was the farthest west. The Americans thought it would be the easier target. They were wrong. They would learn a hard lesson about underestimating the enemy and the land. The Americans gathered a force of about 11,000 men. They were called the 7th Infantry Division. Many of these men came from warm places. They came from Texas and California. They had trained in the desert. They had never seen snow like this. They were not prepared for the cold. They were given winter gear, but it was not enough. They were issued shoes that were not waterproof. They had thin jackets. It was a recipe for disaster. As the invasion fleet gathered in the cold waters, the tension rose. The soldiers on the ships were nervous. They did not know what to expect. They thought the Japanese might surrender easily. They thought the weather would be the only problem. They did not know that the Japanese commander on Attu, Colonel Yasuyo Yamasaki, had a plan. He was a determined leader. He had about 2,500 men. He had dug them into the mountains. He had told them to fight to the death. He had no intention of leaving. He had no intention of surrendering. The ships arrived off the coast of Attu on May 11, 1943. The operation had a name. It was called Operation Land Crab. The name sounded small, but the goal was huge. The United States military wanted to wipe away the stain of occupation. They wanted to reclaim their land. The soldiers on the boats were cold. They were seasick. They peered into the thick gray fog. They could not see the island, but they knew the enemy was waiting. The Japanese had been there for almost a year. They knew the ground. They knew the wind. They had the high ground. The landing did not happen where the Japanese expected. The Americans came ashore in two places. They landed on the northeast side of the island at a place called Holt's Bay. They also landed on the south side at Massacre Bay. The names of these places sounded ominous. They were warnings written on the map. The Americans moved slowly. The terrain was awful. There were no beaches in some places, just rocks and steep cliffs. The soldiers had to climb wet, slippery rocks while carrying heavy packs. They were easy targets. But the Japanese did not fire at first. They were waiting. Colonel Yamasaki, the Japanese commander, had a plan. He pulled his men back. He did not want to fight on the beach. He wanted to fight in the mountains. He knew the Americans had more men. He knew they had more ships. He could not win a direct fight. He wanted to make the Americans come to him. He wanted them to suffer in the cold and the wind before they ever saw a Japanese soldier. The Americans advanced into a world of white. Snow covered the ground. The fog was so thick that soldiers could not see 10 feet in front of them. They marched up the slopes of a mountain called Jarman Pass. They were confused. They were disoriented. Units got lost. Men wandered off and were never seen again. They fell into crevices. They froze to death. The weather was killing them before the enemy could. Then the shooting started. The Japanese soldiers were hidden in bunkers. They were tucked into caves. They had machine guns set up to fire down the slopes. The Americans were caught in the open. The battle turned into a nightmare of small, isolated fights. A platoon would be pinned down by a sniper. A company would be stopped by a single machine gun nest. The Japanese fought with incredible discipline. They did not waste bullets. They waited until the Americans were close. The cold was a third army in the fight. The American soldiers were not dressed for the Arctic. Their boots were thin. Their uniforms were standard issue. Frostbite became a major enemy. Men's feet froze in their boots. Their hands turned black. Medics worked frantically, but they could not stop the cold. Many men who were not shot still had to be evacuated. They lost toes. They lost fingers. The hospital ships filled up with soldiers who had been beaten by the weather. The battle raged for days. It was slow. It was bloody. The Americans had to use heavy artillery to blast the Japanese out of their holes. They used bombs from planes, but the fog often stopped the planes from flying. The soldiers on the ground felt alone. They felt like the world had forgotten them. The news from the battle was censored. The American public did not know how bad it was. They did not know that the easy target of Attu was becoming a slaughter. One of the hardest fights was for a piece of ground called Engineer Hill. It was a strategic point. If the Americans took it, they could see down into the main Japanese camp. The Japanese knew this. They defended it with everything they had. The fighting was hand-to-hand. Men threw grenades into caves. They fired rifles into the fog. They used bayonets. It was primitive warfare in a modern time. After 2 weeks of fighting, the Japanese situation was desperate. They had run out of food. They had run out of water. Their ammunition was low. They were surrounded. The Americans had pushed them back to a small area on the peninsula. Colonel Yamasaki knew the end was near. He made a final, drastic decision. He decided he would not die slowly in a cave. He would not wait for the Americans to come to him. He would go out fighting. On the night of May 29, 1943, the Japanese soldiers did something unexpected. They gathered their remaining strength. They formed a column. They marched silently through the fog. They headed straight for the American lines. It was a banzai charge. This was a suicide attack. They intended to break through the American lines, capture the artillery, and turn the guns on the Americans. It was a desperate gamble. The attack happened in the dark. The Japanese soldiers charged, screaming. They broke through the front lines. They overran the support troops. They rushed the medical station. It was chaos. American soldiers were caught sleeping in their tents. Medics grabbed rifles to fight back. The fighting was brutal and confused. Men fought with knives and entrenching tools. It was a melee. For a short time, it looked like the Japanese might succeed. They penetrated deep into the American rear. They captured a key point called Cleavesy Pass. But the Americans rallied. They formed a defensive line. They used their own artillery, firing at point-blank range. They stopped the charge. Colonel Yamasaki was killed leading his men. He fell with his sword in his hand. By the morning of May 30th, it was over. Almost the entire Japanese garrison was dead. Out of roughly 2,500 soldiers, only 28 survived as prisoners. The rest had died in battle or by their own hand. The Americans had won, but the cost was high. Over 500 American soldiers were killed. Nearly 2,000 were wounded or sick. Many more were victims of the cold. Attu was back in American hands, but it was a grave. With Attu secured, the eyes of the military turned to Kiska. Kiska had a much larger force. The Americans expected a fight even bloodier than Attu. They prepared for weeks. They bombed the island constantly. They shelled it from the sea. They gathered a huge invasion force. This time, they were prepared for the cold. They had better boots and warmer coats. They had learned from the mistakes on Attu. The invasion of Kiska began on August 15, 1943. It was a massive operation. Nearly 30,000 American and Canadian soldiers landed on the beaches. They expected fierce resistance. They expected mines and machine guns. They moved slowly up the beaches, hearts pounding, waiting for the first shot. But the silence was heavy. There was no gunfire. There was no shouting, only the wind. The soldiers explored the island. They found empty tents. They found discarded uniforms. They found half-eaten meals. But they found no Japanese soldiers. The enemy was gone. It was a ghost island. The Americans were stunned. They asked the question, how did they escape? It turned out the Japanese had pulled off a miracle of stealth. Under the cover of thick fog in late July, the Japanese Navy had slipped through the American blockade. They had come on fast ships. They had evacuated all 5,000 soldiers in less than an hour. They left behind booby traps. They left behind fake equipment to fool the observers. They had vanished into the night. The Americans had invaded an empty island. The soldiers called it the Phantom Invasion. It was a relief that no one died in combat, but it was also frustrating. The massive operation had been for nothing. However, the occupation of American soil was officially over. The United States had reclaimed its territory. The enemy was pushed back across the Pacific. The story did not end there for the people who lived there. The Elliott people had suffered terribly. The villagers from Attu who had been taken to Japan were prisoners for the rest of the war. Out of the 42 people taken from Attu, nearly half died in captivity. They died of starvation and disease. They were buried in foreign soil. When the survivors returned after the war, they found their homes destroyed. The Japanese had burned the village. The American bombing had leveled the rest. They had nothing left. The people from other islands, like Unalaska, also faced hardship. The United States military had forced them to leave their homes early in the war. They were moved to camps in Southeast Alaska. These camps were not ready for them. They lived in old canneries and abandoned mines. They had no clean water. They had no warm houses. Many of the elders died. They were refugees in their own country. The war for them was a tragedy of loss. They lost their homes. They lost their traditions. They lost their loved ones. The environment of the islands also bore the scars. The battlefields were littered with wreckage. Old planes lay in the valleys. Ships sat at the bottom of the harbors. The land was torn up by bombs. It would take nature decades to heal the green hills. Today, you can still see the evidence. You can see the old gun emplacements. You can see the rusted metal. It is a silent monument to the war. This campaign, known as the Aleutian Islands Campaign, is often forgotten in the history books. It is overshadowed by the big battles like D-Day or Iwo Jima, but its importance is real. It was the only time enemy forces occupied American soil. It was a time when the safety of the American homeland was broken. It showed the resilience of the American soldier. It showed the cruelty of the weather. It showed the sorrow of the native people. The war in the North ended quietly. The Americans built bases on Attu and Kiska. They used them to bomb the northern islands of Japan. It became a stepping stone to Tokyo. The threat to the American mainland was gone. The door was shut. The enemy was pushed back into the sea. But the memory of the occupation remains. It is a cold story. It is a hard story. It is a story of a wind-swept corner of the world where history was made, far from the eyes of the world.